Hello, it's Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Thanks for joining us for another study of great chapters of the Bible. We're continuing on in part 2 of Exodus chapter 20, that great chapter where God delivers the Ten Commandments to the children of Israel through Moses. And in our first study, we looked at the first 4 commandments, those that deal vertically with the children of Israel and their relationship to God. God makes a segue, and we're going to study the remaining 6 commandments, beginning with commandment chapter 5 about honoring mother and father. Now, the commandments will take on a different kind of perspective. Before, God dealt with their relationship with Him. Now He's going to tell them about their relationships with one another. And the segue is given to us in commandment number 5. Exodus 20 verse 12 says, "Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you." Now, the 5th commandment serves as a transitional role. It's a fitting transition, though. Learning to honor parents would affect how they would look at other authority figures, certainly God. And in a social environment where family ties were leaned on very heavily, parental honor was taken seriously, and for good reason. Before children became aware of God, they knew of the love and the nurture of their parents. And ideally, that love and nurture would cause them to look towards God. They would learn about Him from their parents. And for that crucial role, parents were to be honored. The word honor here comes from the same root word that in other places is translated glory. So this also could be translated give glory to your father and mother. And it's important to see that God is not overstating what is commanded here. The relationship and the honor that they give to their parents was opportunity for them that would take them all the way through life. First of all, there was the opportunity for holiness. In Leviticus chapter 19, God reminded the people that they should be holy because He is holy. And the opportunity to begin learning holiness was not at the tabernacle or at the temple. The opportunity was to learn holiness from mother and father, to realize what that looked like, to emulate their example in the right things that they did towards God. It was an opportunity for children to learn obedience. Parents are the first authority figures that children have, and they need to learn what obedience is like. And God uses the sons of a fellow named Rechab in Jeremiah chapter 35 as examples of what childlike obedience from parents' children ought to look like. They had learned some important things in Jeremiah 35 from their father, and they weren't about to compromise those concepts. They weren't about to compromise their obedience to their father just because someone else wanted them to do something different. But more than anything, was an opportunity for parents to properly instruct their children about God. Deuteronomy chapter 6 reminds us of how we need to make sure that, or at least the Israelites needed to make sure that they taught their children, they took every opportunity to teach their children, whether it was morning, day, or night. Anytime, every time was ideal to teach their children about God. And one reason to honor father and mother is given to us in this commandment. Read it again. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land. Deuteronomy 5 puts it this way, that it may go well with you. I'm going to tell you, God was not kidding. When He meant it would go well with you if you did this, the implication was that it will not go well with you if you fail to honor your father and your mother. And God had built in very strict punishment for children who abused their parents in Exodus 21, Exodus 17, and Deuteronomy 21. The infraction was to be seen as so severe that the death penalty would be induced on those children who abused their parents. If parents had stubborn children, they would bring them before the community And beginning with the parents, those stubborn children would be stoned to death. So God wasn't kidding. And the commandment held honor as a principle that established respect for families. As I said before, parents were to be the authority figures in the family, and especially the father, whose responsibility it was to guide the family. And this is repeated for us in the New Testament in Ephesians chapter 6. The commandment still holds promise for us, and it will go well with us when we show our parents the honor that they deserve. Let's look at the sixth commandment. Exodus 20 verse 13 says simply, "You shall not murder." The sixth commandment addresses an issue that is as old and as serious as man himself. In fact, the very first physical death we see back in the opening pages of Genesis was not that of some old person. It was apparently relatively young man, one young man killing his brother. We should understand that human life is sacred to God. And so it's sensible that God would establish laws concerning the sanctity of that life. We should understand the meaning of the Hebrew word. It's one that I can't pronounce, but it is one of several Hebrew words meaning to kill. But this specific one is used in a way that generally refers to the unlawful taking of life. In Numbers 35 verse 16, it's used in this way: if you struck him down with an iron object so that he died, he is a murderer. In 1 Kings 21:19, "Thus says the Lord, have you murdered and also taken possession?" In Job 24 verse 14, we're told that the murderer rises at dawn, he kills the poor and needy, and at night he is as a thief. God has the authority to govern life itself because he has sovereignty over life. God says, "It is I who put to death, and I who give life." And when we think about human life especially, it's important for us to see that people bear the image of God, and that's why human life is so important to God. We're made in the Creator's image. We are God's image bearers. In Proverbs 14 verse 31, the proverb says, "He who oppresses the poor taunts his maker, but he who is gracious to the needy honors him." Proverbs 17 verse 5 says, "He who mocks the poor taunts his maker. He who rejoices at calamity will not go unpunished." Proverbs 22 verse 2, "The rich and the poor have a common bond. The Lord is the maker of them all." Now there's a difference between men and monkeys because only man was made in the image of God. Murder is an attack on one who ideally bears the image of God, and it's an insult and a dishonor not just to the person who gets killed, certainly, but to the God who made him. And although today murder seems much more common, maybe because we hear about it so much more, but no one really disputes that it's wrong. Everyone believes that murder is wrong. All murder is wrong. And so we should carefully think about the unlawful taking of life, such as abortion, suicide, euthanasia. All of those things reject the sanctity of life, the idea that God is the one who holds life and death in his hands. Christians ought to be the standard bearers for the promotion of the sacredness of the life that God gives. Well, let's continue on. The seventh commandment. In Exodus 20 verse 14, God says, "You shall not commit adultery." And it's not hard for us to remember the ideal of marriage. Remember when we had looked at another lesson in this great chapters of the Bible. We looked at Genesis chapter 2, in which it tells us that a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. God intended that man and woman would be tied in a relationship, and he uses a very strong word for it, a covenant. In Malachi chapter 2 and verse 14, the prophet says that the Lord has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth, against whom you have dealt treacherously, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. Marriage is the foundation of any strong society, and its stability is essential if that society is to remain stable. Marriage is sacred, and so the sexual relationship that can only occur within the parameters, within the bounds of the marriage relationship, is also just as sacred as the covenant that a man and a woman make with one another. Faithfulness is an essential character of those in a covenant, and if the marriage covenant was compromised by infidelity, then marriage would become impersonal. The bond would become meaningless, and faithfulness in any covenantal relationship would become effective. So important was this sacred bond in marriage that God referred to his unfaithful people as those who were involved in spiritual adultery. Now, in the ancient Near East, adultery was considered the great sin. In fact, so important was the principle of marriage covenantal faithfulness that death of the participating parties in adultery was the punishment that God deemed appropriate for those involved in it. And even those who were not God's people saw the importance of not committing adultery. In Genesis chapter 20, Abram, seeking to spare his own neck, had tried to pass off his wife as his sister, and Abimelech, the ruler of that region, had taken her for his wife. And when he realizes it, he realizes the sin that he was to be involved in, and he told Abram, "You brought on me and my kingdom a great sin." And there are a couple of biblical examples that we can look at that help us see that there are lessons to be learned concerning the pitfalls of idolatry. Certainly one of those is the great tragedy of David's life, where he commits adultery with another man's wife and does all kinds of terrible behind the scenes things to try to cover it up. Eventually loses the son that he has with this woman. And after that, even the rest of his family relationships were never the same because of David's great sin. On the other hand, what was a tragedy for David was a triumph for Joseph. You remember Joseph's story. His employer's wife was constantly coming on to him sexually, but Joseph's answer to her was firm. His decision was set. He said, "I cannot do this and sin against God." Now, it would have been a sin against his employer. It would have even been a sin against his employer's wife, the one who was coming on to him, as well as Joseph himself. But he said, ultimately, this sin is against God, and I can't do that. And it's not hard to see that our own society today has trivialized what God takes very seriously. Sexual sin of every stripe abounds, and yet God still wants marriage and the sexual relationship within marriage to be recognized as special, as a covenant. In fact, marriage is the only relationship wherein sexual intimacy can be enjoyed. So it's reasonable that since the marriage covenant is still sacred, illicit sexual activity of any kind, whether it's premarital sex, extramarital sex, or homosexual sex, is still forbidden. The 8th commandment in Exodus chapter 20 and in verse 15 says simply, "You shall not steal." Now, every culture has some prohibition against stealing because it's universally seen as reprehensible. Taking something that doesn't belong to you just isn't right. And most cultures will recognize that. The previous commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery, warned against a type of theft. You were taking something, part of a relationship that belonged to someone else. And this commandment, the eighth one, you shall not steal, enlarges on that idea. The intention of this commandment is to promote another kind of sanctity, the sanctity of private property, as people focus on how they treat the possessions of others, the rights of others, as well as how they use their own rights. The law of Moses established personal property rights that were intended to foster respect and honor for their fellow human being, for their neighbors, for their fellow Israelites especially. God expected honesty and fairness in all their dealings with one another, especially in land, when that was the blessing that God had given to you. In a society that was largely agricultural, laws concerning land, especially boundary laws, were very important. And if you were fiddling with the boundaries of your land, trying to make your land bigger by taking some land from your neighbor, God dealt with that very, very seriously in the law. God also expected fair business dealings with his people. He expected them to be able to whether they were buying or selling, to do it honestly. In fact, there are some proverbs that tell us about the dishonest people who deal with dishonest scales. When you weighed things and determined their value by what they weighed, you can see how folks would be swindled in their business dealings. Of course, property rights, not just land, but in a society where man's wealth was generally based on his property, such as cattle or sheep or donkeys or oxen or something like that, well, there were certainly strict laws concerning those property rights as well. And another thing to think about as we're thinking about stealing are the rights that people had concerning stealing other people. Exodus 21:16, Deuteronomy 24 verse 7 reminds us of those who would be so unscrupulous as to kidnap another person, to steal a person and then sell him. Well, that's a theft as well. And since theft is a serious infraction, it makes sense that it also applies to people. This commandment of not stealing, of course, is reaffirmed for us in the New Testament. Although theft in the 21st century might differ somewhat from theft in ancient Israel. For instance, today we have all kinds of new theft. We have identity theft, literary theft, such as plagiarism, copyright theft, even credit theft. Theft is still theft, and it's still an offense against man because it's an offense against God. Consider the ninth commandment. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Truth is as eternal as God himself, and in fact it's inseparable from his character. Truth is a big deal with God, especially when you are affirming the guilt or the innocence of someone else. Remember back in the Garden of Eden, the serpent denied the truth of God's command and encouraged the woman to eat the fruit in defiance of divine truth. And the results of that action have rippled throughout humanity ever since. Demonstrates clearly that it is God and his word that are true. Lying undermines moral standards. It undermines the foundations that God himself has set. And that's why lying is usually associated with even more glaring sins. But since a God-honoring community is based on truth and trust, God deemed it necessary that he stressed the importance of fairness and truth, and emphasized not only the fairness of it, but the punishment that would come for the infraction of it. In Exodus chapter 23 and verses 1 and 2, Moses tells the people, you shall not bear a false report. Do not join your hand with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not follow the masses in doing evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after a multitude in order to pervert justice. Certainly with all the civil unrest that's going on, those are just important today. We need to make sure that the truth is what prevails, no matter what our feelings are, no matter what our sentiments are, because there's a heavy penalty to pay. In Proverbs 19 verse 19, God told his people, a false witness will not go unpunished, and he who tells lies will perish. It makes sense that the God of truth would take very seriously our dealings with one another concerning issues of truth. And the New Testament is filled with exhortations regarding the reliability and the integrity of those who would follow Jesus. We're called to be people of truth. We're called to be people whose character is trustworthy because we speak the truth. And James was quick to pick up on Jesus' intentions in this, from his Sermon on the Mount. James says in James 5 verse 12, your yes is to be yes, and your no is to be no, so that you will not fall into judgment. And so we, like the ancient Israelites, must speak truth to one another. That's what we're told in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 25, and in verse 29, we're told to make sure that what comes out of our mouth is truthful. And then we take our trustworthiness, we take our truth that is based on the Word of God, and we take it to the world. We show truthfulness to the world, we're told in Colossians 4, verses 5 and 6. Going back to the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20 and verse 17 deals with having an inordinate desire for someone else's stuff. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, we're told. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. You ever heard the old question, how much is enough? The answer is just a little more, right? Well, that pretty much sums up the essence of covetousness. It's a desire that, while in itself is not always wrong, it is wrong when it becomes inordinate, when it is driven by selfishness and dissatisfaction. The Hebrew word for covetousness or to covet, it means to have an intense desire. And it's sometimes translated in different ways, sometimes by the very word desire or delight or pleasance. And it's used in both positive and negative ways, even for God himself. In Proverbs 12 verse 12, it tells us that the wicked man desires the booty of evil men. That's the same root word that's translated covet back in Exodus 20 and verse 17. God covets, or God desires, we're told in Psalm 68 verse 16. Why do you look with envy at the mountain which God has desired for his abode? Psalm 10 verse 3 says that the wicked boasts of his heart's desire. The idea of coveting, having an inordinate desire driven by selfishness and ingratitude, is all throughout the Bible. And the idea is as old as man himself. The first sin. Think about it. Eve reaching for that fruit. Even though she fell for a lie, the sin had covetousness at its root. Eve was attracted to this forbidden fruit. In fact, Genesis 3:6 tells us it was desirable to her. And so thus began man's flirtation with what is not rightfully his. The root of coveting is desiring to possess something at the expense of its legitimate owner. This entire verse, let's read it again. Verse 17, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, his male servant, his female servant, his ox, his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. It's got the idea of recognizing that those things rightfully belong to someone else, and they should leave no doubt that someone else's property is just that. It's someone else's. It's theirs, and you have no right to what belongs to someone else. And this commandment really gives us the idea of it helps us see God's foresight. He was fully aware of the pitfalls that would fall upon his people in the new land. Remember, they're in the wilderness in Exodus chapter 20, and it would take 38 more years for them to finally get to where they were going. But once they got into that land, they would need to be satisfied with what God would give to them. What God intended for them in that land was a satisfactory inheritance. Unfortunately, though, their satisfaction didn't last long. In fact, their dissatisfaction began before they even had taken possession of the land. Achan, in Joshua chapter 7, his dissatisfaction put the entire community at risk. He coveted what wasn't his. He coveted what God specifically said, don't take. And his desire turned into sin. He took it, and we know about the loss that they suffered because of Achan's envy. And we know about the punishment that came upon Achan and his whole family because of his greediness. Later on, David coveted not something, but someone that belonged to someone else, someone that he had no right to, someone that the aspect of his sin had a relation directly to this commandment. The sordid desire that David had for another man's wife certainly came back to haunt him. And as a final example, there's Ahab, 1 Kings 21, where he desired something of that satisfying inheritance that belonged to someone else. He wanted the vineyard of another man, and of course the other man was unwilling to sell it because it was his. It belonged to him. He had the right to it. Ahab, even though he was king, had absolutely no right to it. Now, on the one hand, this commandment is about respecting the property of others. But there's something deeper that's going on here. More deeply, it's about being content with what we have and not longing for something we don't have that we see belongs to others. The New Testament bears witness to that by reminding us to choose contentment over selfishness. Paul reminds us of being content in whatever situation we find ourselves in, just as he was in Philippians chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. We're told that we should choose godliness over greediness. In 2 Peter chapter 1, 1 Timothy chapter 4, I'll leave those for you to look at yourself. But just those should be enough to remind us that desire, covetousness, inordinate desire driven by self-satisfaction, dissatisfaction, greediness, only results in disaster. So we've come to the end of these 10 commandments. And having said all that we've said in these 2 lessons about them, even though we're not under the 10 commandments, 9 of them are reiterated for us in the new covenant, and the one that we're not under today, the 4th commandment, still has implications for us. And we talked about that in our first lesson. But what I want us to see is that these 10 commandments hold for us timely qualities that we need still today. First of all, they help show man his sin. And by establishing moral absolutes, they serve us as a standard for moral human behavior, because they come from the one who has the right to set that standard. But while they show us our failing to live up to that standard, they remind us of our need. They point to our need of a Savior. The entire Old Testament law, not just the 10 Commandments, but the 603 other laws, pardon me, were a vehicle to take people from sinfulness to faith in Christ. And so they help to remind us that man keeps messing up, and we need to look to the one who can help us, the one who did help us, the one who continues to help us, God who sent his Son. And finally, they declare the righteous standards that reflect to us the holiness of God. We may never be perfectly flawless in this life. In fact, we will never be perfectly flawless in this life. But the 10 Commandments provide an opportunity to show the world God's righteous standard as we strive to live up to his distinctive call of noble thought lived out in a righteous life. The 10 Commandments are important, and there's good reason why they're given so much thought, why so many volumes of text have been dedicated to expounding upon them. But more than anything, they help us to see that God is the great lawgiver, and he gives no law that doesn't have benefit for us. Well, thanks for studying with us this study of the 10 Commandments in these two parts, and I hope they've whet your appetite for more study. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again next time on Great Chapters of the Bible. Thanks. God bless you.